several states move to dilute their labour laws, 10 central unions have come together to jointly condemn the move. The unions have called the decisions, and I quote, an inhuman crime and brutality on working people, end of quote. Uttar Pradesh has suspended several labour-related legislations for 3 years, and Madhya Pradesh has done it for 1,000 days. Effectively, in these states, companies will have greater flexibility in determining minimum wages. There will be far lesser checks on working conditions and a much diluted guarantee of occupational safety. While some of these changes have drawn condemnation, India's labour laws are indeed archaic and in need of an overhaul. Sample this. India has over 40 central labour laws and over 200 state laws. So do we really need so many laws, or does this simply foster Inspector Raj? The recent economic survey called for overhauling labour laws to unleash the potential of India's small businesses by dedicating a separate chapter to it. The survey makes the case that deregulated and flexible labour laws are the way forward to boost productivity and create jobs. Now, the author of the survey, Chief Economic Advisor Krishnamurthy, told me that steps taken by Uttar Pradesh and the Madhya Pradesh governments should be the way forward for reforming labour laws. He also added that restrictions posed by existing laws have stopped many companies from growing big, thereby creating a large informal sector. So is this the right time to dilute labour laws and dilute them in this fashion? How can states undertake labour reform to make it a win-win for both the employer and the employee? Joining me now to take this discussion forward is MS Unnikrishnan, the Chairman of Industrial Relations at CII's National Committee. He's also the Managing Director and the CEO of Thermax Limited. We also have with us B. Tyagarajan, the Deputy Chairman of CII Western Region and the Managing Director of Blue Star. Also with us is K. Vaidyanathan, ISB Alumni Endowment Research Fellow and Faculty Director of PGP Finance. Many thanks, gentlemen, for joining us here on the program. Maitresh Ghatak will also join us shortly. Mr. Unnikrishnan, let me come to you first, sir. It is, not up for debate the fact that we've had a complexity of labour regulation in this country. I've been, on this channel for the last 20 years, and every budget, this is a demand that's made by industry. But the question is this the way to go about it? Does deregulation mean complete suspension in the manner in which Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh have moved?
Well, Shereen, there is a context to that also we could understand. There were companies who were from the essential services and also in the food production, drug production area, where they were never to be closing the factories. The moment the government of India declared a lockdown and also insisted that the industry is going to pay them salaries, there were workers from very, very good companies. I'm not naming them. Some of the finest of the Indian companies who treat labor more than maybe the white collar, they refused to go for work. Now, what is the choice available at this point of time? So, first and foremost, on the other side, 45 days of lockdown has costed us almost equivalent to our entire GST collection for the day. We want to restart the economic engine. So, all of us are trying for it. But if workers aren't available, how is going to be restarting the economy? So, we need to insist upon that at this point of time, what is done by UP and the other Madhya Pradesh, they have suspended they didn't say they're cancelling it right now. So take it in the right side. Right now, it is suspended for a period of 3 years. So that's it. Yeah. So we need to be restarting.
No,
and that is the first requirement. Yeah.
I understand corporate India's logic to say that we need to restart, and to restart we need migrant labour. But the lockdown was not the fault of the labour, sir. The lockdown was a decision announced by the central government. Now, to coerce and give no choice to the migrant labour in a situation like this, surely that isn't the way to build trust. That isn't going to be the way to bring them back. That will in fact make matters worse. Wouldn't you believe at this time the need for communication, the need to offer empathy, the need to tell them that, look, we are providing you with a safety net and hence we request you to come back to work. Don't you believe that that has to be the way forward, not coercion?
100% I agree with you. What I mentioned earlier was pertaining to the permanent labor staying in the city, not the migrant labor, because the permanent labor normally do stay in the city. Now, just to give you a heads up on that front, the moment we notice is, we have had a very private dialogue with the general secretaries of the largest two unions of this country. I'm not naming them. The single largest union and the second largest union of this, the national general secretaries were spoken into by us, And we exactly wanted to do what you just mentioned about a communication to go from them, that first and foremost, we will ensure there is an insurance available for them COVID. Second, there will be a compensation-oriented kind of a system that we want to work out in the unlikely event of a death happening. Third and most important, how we will be as an industry practicing all the safety practices which are not there in existence. And we will take care of social distancing, physical distancing, every PPE needed for right from mask to everything, only 1/3 of the people sitting in a bus and ensuring that there are 2 shifts of work, all that spoken about. So it's already initiated by us. I'm not talking about migrant labor at all, Shereen, at this point. I'm talking about what we need for the main industry to start as a permanent workman. Our suppliers in the tier 1 and tier 2 will be needing migrant labor because MSMEs do normally employ a lot of migrant labor. We are with them, and my heart goes for them.
The fear of COVID is the same whether it's a migrant labor or it is a permanent employee. The fear of COVID is what is holding people back at this point in time, and that's the same whether you're migrant labor or a permanent employee. But Mr. Tyagarajan, I want to get you on into this conversation because Mr. Unnikrishnan is pointing out that at this point in time to restart the economy, perhaps suspension of labor laws is required to be able to get the permanent labor back into the workforce. Now, my question is, and we haven't seen appropriate communication from either of the state governments. Now, let me just pick up what is being reported as far as Madhya Pradesh is concerned. Some of the laws that Madhya Pradesh has decided to do away with, which include the Act on the Rights of Workers. Now, it says that the employer is not bound to provide workers with ventilation, lighting, toilets, sitting facilities, first aid boxes, protective equipment, canteens, creches, weekly holidays, and interval of rest. I mean, surely this is not what what corporate citizens like you would want. Is there something that you support, bringing in measures that ensure that not even the basics are provided?
Good evening, Shereen. Thank you for having me in your panel. I entirely agree there has to be a right balance. There is no quarrel with that. And same way, Unni, my colleague in CII, he has brought out the points. That is the position of the industry per se. Now, we have to understand the context as well. We have to get started. This particular provisions are ephemeral in nature. It is not that industry is asking for these provisions to be permanent. Now, let us wind back a little, if you do not mind. The rural economy was completely ignored earlier. Labor reforms never we attempted to do in a full-fledged manner. Even the fixed term employment which was introduced, there was apathy from the state governments to implement that. Industry suffered. There was Industry 4.0 related loss of jobs, and that entire workforce is supposed to migrate to the construction sector or services sector. Now, added to that, we had the National Disaster Management Act related Human Resources Ministry notification that whether they are working or not working, you have to pay. The industry ended up paying the salary, most of us. There may be aberrations, but every one of us pay. In this particular context, you have to protect the industry. We have to get started, and we will be considerate. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Added to that, I can tell you, CII is working on a very major program because I co-chair the National Agriculture Council, how to tackle this migrant laborers who have migrated there. What is the economy to be provided for? I don't think they are going to come back, in my view, for at least 9 months. That is my view.
Okay, you're saying that the migrant labor will not return for the 9 months, and Mr. Unnikrishnan fears that the permanent workforce will also not return given the fear of COVID, and hence these measures are needed at this point in time. Let me bring in Mr. K. Vaidyanathan as well. Mr. Vaidyanathan, the argument that has been put forward by the two state governments that have decided to do away with the labor regulations is that this is being done to invite fresh investments. This is being done to woo investors who are looking at moving supply chains out of China, and this will be an opportunity for India to capitalize on. Now, will global investors view it that way? Because global investors want certainty. Now, global investors will perhaps have to weigh what happens after 3 years or what happens after 1,000 days. Will this pitch work with global investors who want a predictable environment? And at this point in time, well, state governments are saying no labor laws or very few labor laws for 3 years in the case of UP or 1,000 days in the case of MP. But, you know, who knows what comes next or after?
Okay, Shereen, let's get our facts right, okay? So I'm just going to take a step back and talk about the labor market first, very briefly, and then talk about, you know, the representation that these unions have and, you know, what percentage are we talking about. So our total labor force is 46.5 crores. That's our labor force, okay?
Yes.
Of that, the informal sector is 41.5 crores, which means the unions represent only 5%. That's barely 11% of the workforce. Okay. Now we have a very dichotomized labor market. We have on one hand these 11% which are unionized and have all the safety security, and wherein, you know, even if a firm has to shut down, they get permission from the state government. And then you have this 89%, 90% of this informal sector which doesn't have any of these benefits. So when these unions are talking about, they only represent 7% of the workforce. Okay, that's my point number one.
I understand that. I understand that.
Now, so your point about, you know, getting investments from China. Now, the changes that are being made, some of them are being made for the pandemic. Okay, so there is a change in the Shops and Establishment Act, wherein what the changes says is that instead of shops being open from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., the shops will now be open from 6 a.m. to 12 a.m. Okay, now that's basically purely from the perspective of the pandemic. Now, as the CA has said, and, you know, as has been mentioned in the economic survey, there is a possibility or an opportunity, if you would like, of getting some of the supply chain from China onto India, because the world has realized that, you know, the supply chain was completely shut down from Jan to March. And if you put all your eggs in one basket, that is China, the supply chain could get you know, disrupted at any point in time. So they're looking for India as an opportunity. Yeah. We don't want, so right, we have 44 central laws for labor because it's a concomitant subject, and, you know, the states also legislate. There's some 150 plus labor laws of different states. And, you know, there is a boutique industry of consulting services, legal consulting services for foreign firms. They just briefed them about the labor laws in the, so you know how tenuous these labor laws are.
No, so Mr. Vaidyanathan, Mr. Vaidyanathan, just a second, sir. I'm in agreement with you. In fact, as you might have noticed at the very start, we said that India does not require 40 central laws and 200 plus state laws. We're in agreement there. The question, though, is this the right timing and the manner in which it is being done by way of ordinances? Because let's also remember that the central government is in the process of designing for labor codes. That process has been underway. What has been announced by UP and MP and now, you know, might be taken forward by other governments is the ordinance route without much clarity on how this is going to work. So I understand the argument that you're making, but the point that you know, from the other side is that this may in fact make matters worse. Let me come back to you, but let me get in Maitresh Ghatak, professor at the London School of Economics, also with us. Maitresh, many thanks for joining us. We are still awaiting, as I pointed out, details of these ordinances that have been moved by UP and MP. We don't know what the centre will choose to do because the presidential assent is still awaited. As I pointed out, there are labour codes that are being reviewed by the centre at this point in time. Do you believe that this ordinance route taken by these two state governments, and perhaps others may follow suit, will make matters worse as we get out of this lockdown and try and kickstart economic activity? Or do you believe that this will in fact bring in the fresh investment to restart economic activity, which is the hope of the government?
I don't think this is the obvious reform that I would have expected at the moment, because essentially we are going through a once-in-a-century crisis, public health crisis, which has led to a complete economic lockdown of the country and various other countries as well. And before the crisis started, if anything, the economy had slowed down quite a bit, and there were signs of persistent slowdown, etc. And the general consensus that had emerged was this was a demand-side problem that would basically, look, if consumer demand is not forthcoming, investment demand will be stalling as well. So labor laws, whatever their merits, and there is enough controversy about that. I mean, labor laws are fundamentally a supply side measure on the labor market, right? So if you believe the supporters, labor laws are what is preventing from the kind of labor markets functioning at a much higher level of hiring people, workers moving around. So it's a, I don't know, when you have a drought situation, does digging more ditches and things like that, is that the best way to approach the problem? I'm not, as you rightly said, that we don't have enough of the details and how much the other states are going to follow and what the center is going to do, but it's not a first order response that I would have expected.
Okay. Not a first order response that you would have expected. But let me go back to Mr. Unnikrishnan. Mr. Unnikrishnan, you're saying that at this point in time, this is necessary because you need to restart economic activity and industry is facing trouble with getting the permanent workers to return to work. Now, how bad is the situation? Give me an example of Thermax, for instance, sir. What is the current capacity utilization? Where are you facing the challenges? Because there's also a lot of confusion. There is no public transport that's available. There is confusion on red zones, orange zones, the movement of people and so on and so forth. So are those also constraints that are forcing perhaps permanent employees to not return to work?
Well, arranging transport permits and everything is a responsibility of the managements of companies. So those constraints are there for the companies, but not for the individual worker, which is being taken care of by the companies. More importantly, there are some positives in what you mentioned about, but what we are currently talking about is most of the factories currently are running between maybe 25 to 35%. Very rare, very few who never shut down may be running at maybe a 40-50%. Now, as we are moving further, there are also restrictions. I fully agree with you that a person living in a red zone in a city cannot move to a green zone factory at the outskirts. So that itself is a challenge. So what did we propose to the government that way? With the available labor, allow us to, if there is a consent from the labor, let's not restrain the working hours to 8. If it is an easygoing work, if the person is willing to work for up to 12 hours, we are willing to pay overtime. Fundamentally, you should recognize the catch-22 situation we're in. We need to produce, we need to sell. The moment it happens, the taxes go to the government. The government will be able to then utilize that money to support the migrant labor and the poor people. So we need to have a clarity that we have done enough and more harm to the Indian economy, whether it is in the services sector or in the manufacturing sector. Agriculture sector is only 14 to 15% of GDP. Unless otherwise we reach to a level of maybe a 60 to 70% productivity level of all the installed capacities, by at least I would say September, we are going to be in deeper trouble. So we need to do this, and it's an emergency situation. In an emergency situation, operating emergency action. All of us, see, our heart goes to all the workmen. Please don't believe that. See, let me ask the counter question. The people who work in all the hospitals dealing with COVID patients, the policemen on the road, the essential services employees, are they not exposed? Are they not being provided PPE? So the organized sector and what my colleague Vaidya mentioned about unorganized sector also will be given. We need to have it started somewhere so that there is sufficient time available for everybody to come to a absolute conformity with all the requirements. This is starting point only. And second is, India is not the only destination for the international investment to come. There is Thailand, there is Vietnam, there is India or Indonesia available. So I really respect the Chief Minister of these two states, and I'm urging to the rest of them also, please compete with each other to ensure that we are able to be providing the succor and support needed for the international investor to look at India as an investment center, which will create further jobs. That is where it is, like the migrant labor, like my friend Tyagarajan spoke about. Once they reach the villages, and now Karnataka is told they can directly buy land from farmers. What does it mean? The new investment going to come to India can go to the rural area. We will create jobs there fundamentally. Look at that.
add up to...
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you're right about the fact that labor is... Mr. Vaidyanathan, I'm just coming to you, sir. Just coming to you. Labor is only one of the issues. When investors, whether domestic or foreign, look at investing in a particular region, they will look at human capital, they will look at land, infrastructure, and all of those other issues as well. Labor is one of those. But Mr. Tyagarajan, you know, there's a lot of intermingling of issues that's going on over here. What Mr. Unnikrishnan seems to be suggesting very clearly is that what we need is a temporary suspension of certain provisions to ensure that we can restart economic activity. Whereas what seems to be happening is this is being done to foreign investors as well. You know, this is being done to make India the preferred destination outside of China, and, you know, so on and so forth. Other states will follow suit. Now, if you can specify for me, like Mr. Unnikrishnan said, that one of the key asks of industry is that you extend the working hours from 8 to 12 hours with overtime. If you can specify for me, what is the need of industry today to ensure that economic activity can restart?
Yeah, Shereen, as I mentioned earlier, I fully endorse the view. This is ephemeral in nature. It is for a short period of time. Second thing is, by the very code of conduct, CII member companies follow a principle that everyone will be treated equally, whether it is permanent or temporary contract workers. The mistake that had happened is, if the fixed term employment reforms would have been implemented much ahead of it by the states, the situation might have been different. You also need to understand it is not just the manufacturing sector. It is the construction sector which would have lost many migrant laborers. And also today I hear that many trucks are not able to operate because drivers have disappeared to their native places. Now, the corporates hire these migrant laborers through a service provider. Now, this intermediary, how he is going to remobilize back, we do not know. The need of the hour is get started, and it is not even if a government says this provision is for 100 days, some companies may come forward and suspend it in 30 days and carry on with the routine manner. All of us are putting efforts to get back
workers. One second, sir. Mr. Tyagarajan, 1 second, because both you and Mr. Unnikrishnan are very clearly saying that these are changes that are required, that are ephemeral in nature. What does that mean? In your understanding, or what is CII's demand? What should be the time period? What should be the sunset clause on the suspension of these provisions?
This depends on each company, actually. See, if it is a construction site, first of all, it is not clear. It is red, orange, green, and containment zones, which project sites will come up when, and what kind of laborers there are to be. So there is a total confusion that is prevailing in the marketplace. So therefore, urgently, we are in need of some 60 workers, 100 workers. I am not able to put a time frame at all. All that we are saying is little more flexible at this point of our time. See, we should not be looked at, we are some anti-labor entity at all. We are for the welfare of the laborers. That's why I added. Like, parallelly, another exercise is going on. We are estimating these workers have gone back to the rural village, rural places, whether there is hospital infrastructure there, how they will productively employed. And there is a massive amount of work we are doing. How to build different skills to them so that at least next 6 to 9 months they can survive. See, this is very, very short term.
I get the point that you're making. I get the point that you're making, very, very short term, but you're unable to tell me what that time period could be. But Mr. Vaidyanathan, you know, listening to what Mr. Unnikrishnan and Mr. Tyagarajan are saying, that the need of the hour for industry at this point in time is for emergency measures, emergency actions to take care of the current crisis. Now, what should the first order response then be? Because the centre at this point in time will go over what UP is proposing, what MP is proposing. What do you believe has to be the best way forward? Because even in the economic survey, which laid out a prescription for deregulation, did not lay out a prescription for doing away with all labour legislation, as is currently the case in UP and MP.
Okay, Shereen, I want to do a correction. You know, it seems like, you seem to suggest that the changes that have been made are either ad hoc or arbitrary. Now, if you look into the details, and you haven't mentioned the details, I'm happy to mention the details very, very quickly.
Please.
These are neither arbitrary nor ad hoc. And I don't want to do emotional economics here just because it concerns wages and the 11% of unionized labor, I don't want to be emotional and do bad economics. Okay, we need to look beyond the immediate special, which is the unions. Okay. Now, firstly, I just wanted to add to what Mr. Unnikrishnan said. If you look at our GDP contribution of agriculture, which is the largest employer, and all of that is informal employment, and the third largest employer, which is construction, they contribute only 13.9%, which is agriculture, and 8% is construction. But they employ about 56% of our workforce. Okay. Now, but the rest of the sector, which is services and manufacturing. Now, manufacturing contributes about 15.4% of GDP, employs about 12% of the workforce, and services employs about 31% of workforce and contributes to close to 58% of GDP. Now, what you're doing here is to basically make labor laws easy so that the sectors that contribute the maximum to the GDP, those sectors have more flexibility in terms of recruitment. Now, the ground reality is this, that you seem to, I mean, the discourse seemed to be that, you know, the 11% are being done away with, are given a hard deal, and, you know, the way it actually works is that most of these manufacturing companies and even services companies, they actually employ contract labor. And many of these reforms that have been taken, undertaken, are on the contract labor laws, are on ease of compliance, are in the Factories Act, are in the Industrial Disputes Act. And if you read the details, which some other panel members may not have read, they perfectly make economic sense. So let's not do bad economics. Let's not just focus on just do the unions.
Okay. Okay, no, I get the point that you're making, and which is why we've got each one of you to share with us what you make of these changes and what the impact is going to be. But, let me go back to Maitresh. Maitresh, as you just heard here, that this is the best time to make these moves, and that we're looking at a shift in the global supply chain. We're also looking at a big shift in the domestic market. If this flexibility gives companies the ability to draw in big ticket investments or make fresh investments, so be it.
I can see this argument, but the main empirical counter to that argument is, if anybody who was not kind of hibernating in the last 3 weeks would watch on media, digital or otherwise, about the spectacle of migrant workers essentially trekking back home, right? So, and only lately some of the train services, etc. And let me not even, we are all aware of some of the human tragedies that have unfolded. But given the migrant workers, internal migrant workers are a big part of our overall labor force, and in a crisis like that, when they were cut off from their essentially wage payments, sources of supplies, etc., and they had no option to head back home, do you think in some ways labor laws that would make it easier to hire and fire, is that the way to attract these workers back? I think what is missing here is there is a labor supply curve too. I think one of the problems that anybody with Eco 101 knowledge of labor markets would acknowledge, there's supply and there's demand. Now, it's not like that the labor demand side, which is the firm side of the demand, which regulation presumably would affect, and I take that point, but you're taking supply for granted. Now, this could well be true in a labor surplus economy in normal times, but all the research on labor migration, internal migration, shows that there's actually massive under-migration compared to the potential, labor supply that's out there in a dense country like ours. And the main factor that researchers have showed very, very carefully is risk aversion. If you're already on margins of subsistence and you have at least a way to eke out a subsistence living in the villages, going to the city, and then this whole demonstration effect of what happened over the last 2-3 weeks. Imagine, put yourself or myself in the shoes, and so we're thinking international migration. Some conditions improve. Why on earth would these workers be sort of lining up to work at the moment?
Okay, let me get a final comment in from Mr. Unnikrishnan as well as Mr. Vaidyanathan. And very quickly, Mr. Unnikrishnan, in exactly 10 seconds, you know, to address the concerns that have been raised, and I would imagine that industry will continue to engage with stakeholders, your employees at this point in time. You know, how would you like to ensure that there is a message that goes out that the guardrails will be in place, even as more states perhaps move down this road?
We will want to communicate and will continue to be communicating even with the contract labor may not be employed by some of the larger companies, but indirectly through our tier 2 and tier 1 MSME suppliers, that they will be protected and everything needed to ensure their health is protected will be done. If there is a vaccine going to be produced in this country, we will insist upon that each of our suppliers will ensure that it is given to their temporary or contract labor. There are multiple things that we're currently working on, a code of conduct for all the members of the industry to ensure that human life is protected. One thing I want everybody to understand, we are not sitting here with that kind of greed in our mind. Currently, even we are concerned about that. The people who went to the villages, what is the livelihood for them? They ran away from farming and that they came into the cities for a job. Yeah. So they have to come back, and we will want them to be coming back, and we will be dialoguing with the unions of this country, whether it is organized sector or unorganized sector. We will have massive communication done to ensure that they come back. We want them back.
Yeah, yes, and I think that is an important message that they are wanted back. Mr. Vaidyanathan, I'll give you the final say, sir. The same question to you. As we move forward, and of course this is still awaiting presidential assent, what to your mind will need to be the safeguards that will or ought to be put in place?
So firstly, the safeguards exist as before. The changes are only for new firms. Old firms, some relaxation has been done. And the only reason we have only 11% organized sector is because we have these, these onerous laws. Okay, so once you relax these laws, these informal sectors, the migrant workers to whom we pay homage to, they can actually get recruited in the formal sector. That's point number one. Secondly, the marginal propensity to consume of these laborers is quite high, and they're actually using whatever savings they have as of now. So the elasticity of supply in terms of labor is really high. And in terms of the lockdown is only till 17th of May. Once the lockdown is over, migrant workers can come back with all those safeguards to make sure that the pandemic doesn't reach worrying proportions.
Well, there's an uncertainty on whether the lockdown will lift or will continue post the 17th in the fashion that we've gotten used to. There was a meeting today with the Prime Minister. So we should know soon enough. But to Mr. Tyagarajan's point, even when the lockdown lifts, his concern is that we perhaps will not see migrant labour returning for many months. In fact, that's a concern that's been expressed by the Labour Minister Santosh Gangwar himself here on CNBC TV18. This is a complex issue, one that will not be addressed in one television discussion. We will continue to have you gentlemen back with us to discuss the minutiae and the details. But for this evening, Mr. Unnikrishnan, Mr. Tyagarajan, Mr. Vaidyanathan and Maitresh Ghatak, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. That's a wrap. We'll take a quick break. We're back with more.